Mark, we've got a pretty shocking new update on the legal front. There are a raft of new law firms that have opted to capitulate. This comes in the aftermath of already a handful of law firms that have capitulated to Trump. Only now we're seeing that, surprise, surprise, the price for these law firms has conspicuously gone up. Can I have your reaction to that?
I mean, the fact that these big law firms are one by one signing on to Donald Trump's, capitulation plan is absolutely shameful. The fact that the price is going up at the time that they're doing it, perhaps it's a sign that there really is inflation in the economy. These tariffs have already impacted these law firms. They went up from 100 million to now 125
Well,
million
actually, I mean,
dollars.
Paul Weiss paid $40 million. That was the
They got
first
to
go
steal.
around. They got to
I mean,
steal.
let me tell you, Paul Weiss is the most despicable of all the law firms because they are the ones who went first.
Right. They
They're
opened the
the ones who broke.
floodgates.
They opened the floodgates, but they did get away with a bargain at $40
Right.
million. Now, my reaction to this is that it just shows Donald Trump, is going to abuse all of these law firms to the maximum extent possible.
Yeah.
To the extent that Paul Weiss, perhaps in the beginning, thought, well, we'll say this thing and it won't really matter and he'll forget about it and he'll move on. Well, that's not true. I mean, that's turned out not to be true. And now, like you said, the law firms are literally signing up for this type of humiliation. I mean, the fact is that Latham and Watkins, Kirkland and Ellis, A&O Sherman and Simpson Thatcher, as far as they never got an executive order. None of these firms ever got an executive order. It's not even clear to me that Donald Trump had ever heard of some of these law firms, with all due respect to them. They are like proactively, apparently, calling up the White House operator and saying, hi, yes, I am a spineless, gutless law firm. You may never have heard of us, but we would like to know where we can go to collaborate with Donald Trump's undermining of democracy. Yes, I'll hold. I'll hold for as long as it takes.
Yeah.
I got nothing else to do other than suck up to Donald Trump all day. So just keep me on the line.
Yeah. What is the plan now? I know that we have an update in terms of what Trump actually wants to do with these people now that he's collecting law firms and the promised amount, the pledged amount for him has exceeded $500 million.
Right. So this is where, all these supposedly sophisticated lawyers turned out to be a bunch of naive idiots. Because, like I said, they thought that they would make a deal with Donald Trump to do pro bono. And since they were already doing pro bono, it would sort of get washed off the table and no one would ever really double back. And Donald Trump would be able to have his post on Truth Social.
Right.
And
big PR win that he wanted.
And then that would be it. But no, Donald Trump's version of what happened is that these law firms now owe him this spend in legal fees. And Donald Trump is not an unsophisticated consumer of legal services. He's had a lot of experience over the years in both employing lawyers and stiffing lawyers. So he knows how to drive a bargain or drive what he views as a good deal with law firms. And so his words over the last few days have indicated he expects that these law firms are going to be at his beck and call. And he has already said that with respect to representing coal interests, he's going to expect some of these law firms to spend some of this money to do what he wants. With respect to negotiating tariffs, he has said that he's going to call upon these big law firms to do his bidding in negotiating tariffs. Now, I'm sure these law firms are sitting back in horror saying, wait a second, we didn't agree we'd represent the coal industry.
But you know what? You kind of did, because when you decide to sell your soul to this guy, knowing that he's a bad faith actor, knowing that he will abuse the legal system at every turn, this is kind of what you signed up for.
Right.
You don't get to be upset. You don't get to feign shock that somebody who, when you make a deal with the devil, that there are negative consequences that come with that maybe the devil was acting in a little bit worse faith than you thought he would.
Right. The other thing I'm sure the law firms are thinking is, well, for it to be pro bono, it has to be in the public interest. It can't be for private gain. And maybe what Donald Trump's looking for is something here that might not qualify as pro bono, or it has to run through our conflicts department. Donald Trump is like, fuck that.
Right.
Like, I don't care about any of those things. You owe me the legal services.
Right.
And so I think we're about to see a real awakening for some of these law firms that thought they were so clever in cutting these deals.
Right.
That Donald Trump owns them. Like, because the other thing is, none of these law firms can now come out and say, no, 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 that's not part of the deal.
Right,
Right.
you had that's the thing
Right.
that I think is most important here. They had the opportunity to fight. And so is it gonna be that much more difficult now that they've sold their souls to him, now that they've, bent the knee and gone to the White House and basically handed him exactly what he was looking for? If they wanna renege, does it make it all the more difficult now that they've basically, capitulated and sold themselves out?
Yeah, because here's the thing, they sold themselves out. They debased themselves. They humiliated themselves because they thought that if they did that, it would prevent them from being on Donald Trump's bad side. It
Right,
would prevent them from being
right.
that there would not be government weaponized against them. Well, if they now don't go through the deal,
Gonna be even
then they
worse.
face the then they face right then they face the weaponization, but just worse.
I believe there was a memo showing 600 law firms backing Perkins Coie in their effort to push back against this administration. And so they could have easily just signed on to that and been part of this big army of law firms that are actually standing up for the values they purport to hold. But now if they want to present themselves as an obstacle, uh, it's gonna be even more difficult because now you've personally defied Donald Trump, and
Right.
so it's gonna be that much like there was a whole group of people that are willing to stand up to him, but you opted to make life more difficult for those 600 law firms by emboldening Trump. You don't really get to switch sides now because you are the reason that Donald Trump does feel so emboldened.
Right. And there's now this cowardice caucus, right? There's now this like
Yeah.
convening of the cowardly lawyers, and they are part of them and they're branded as such. And like, I'm not sure that they're wanted back in the fight group. I mean, these are folks that made it that much harder for everyone else standing up against Donald Trump. It made it harder for law firms. It made it harder for individual citizens. If you're out there in watching this and you have been part of a protest, it made it harder for you. I mean, it may not feel like you are connected necessarily to the big law firms, but every time a big institution bows down and bends and scrapes, it makes it harder for everyone
Yeah.
else because everyone else then carries a little bit more on their shoulders of potentially being targeted. So, from my standpoint, this is like, cowards love company. Let them just stay in the coward camp, and they should do whatever Donald Trump wants. I hope they serve all of his interests. But I hope this. I also hope that they don't expect that they will be doing work for progressive organizations. And any progressive organization certainly should not be letting these folks, sort of blue wash themselves back into polite company. They ought to be treated as the pariahs that they have become, and that includes the partners who decide to stay there. One of the things we have seen is that associates in these firms have shown a lot more courage than a lot of the partners have.
Yeah.
Hopefully, that'll change in the weeks or months to come.
Can you give us some insight from kind of behind the curtain there? Obviously, most of us watching right now are not lawyers working in law firms, but what's the chatter been like behind the scenes with regard to the folks who are working at these firms, to the partners who did opt to capitulate?
Look, I think that there is sort of two sets of reactions. On the one hand, people are like, "Well, we understand they have, they're partners in these firms, and they're intertwined with them for business, and they make a lot of money, and they didn't want this, and a lot of them will say they asked the firms not to do it, and they opposed it, and that's like." On the one hand. On the other hand, people are also saying like, yeah, but like they have enough money that they can go someplace else,
Yeah.
right? They don't need to put up with this. So, on the one hand, there is some understanding of the situation they find themselves in, but there's not a lot of sympathy for what they're doing as a result. And again, I want to give some grace to those partners because it has only been a few days for some, it's been a few weeks for others, and it may take time to extricate themselves and find someplace else to go. Let's check back in a couple of months and see who's still there and who's not.
Yeah. And finally, let's finish off with this. What would your message be to those law firms that have yet to be targeted, knowing full well that Trump obviously smells blood in the water? He started off with just a handful of law firms. The fact that again we saw Paul Weiss, for example, capitulate gave him this sense that, oh, all I have to do to start collecting law firms, to start doing my legal bidding for me, is to put pressure on these folks. And so, now we've seen more and more and more, and it's growing by the day. And so, what is your message moving forward to these people who see an even more emboldened Trump by virtue of the fact that he's got quite a few large law firms in his pocket now. And it's going to be that much more difficult, even with the 600 law firms that are backing the Perkins Coie's of the world and the ELGs of the world. It's still going to be that much more difficult to push back against this administration. And so, what is your message to those folks who have yet to be targeted, who have yet to come out and take a side, so to speak?
Yeah. So I'd say a few things. The first is, even if you don't have courage, have dignity. Have some
Yeah,
basic dignity. I mean, at some point, you need to look yourself in the mirror, and because I will tell you, everyone else is looking at you and asking, does this person have enough self-respect to stand up on what everyone knows that they know is the right side,
yeah,
right? Like everyone knows that you are not speaking out, not because you don't believe, but because you are afraid. So the first thing I'd say is just have some dignity. The second thing I'd say is that, there is no making a deal with Donald Trump. There is no thinking that you're going to hide and he's not going to notice you. Okay. There's no strategy for the next 3.5 years by which you just cower and hide and it all blows over. We're all going to be forced to make a choice. And so you can either make that choice now and be part of the brave, part of the coalition of people who are standing up for democracy, who will be viewed as having done the right thing, or you can just sort of hide. And eventually the question will be called. And at that point, you will be weaker rather than stronger to stand up and to
right.
resist. But finally, I'd say this, we all live in the moment, right? We're all living, making the decisions we're making now. And it is very hard to make decisions for future you. But I promise you this, in 2 years and 5 years and 10 year future you is going to want you to have stood up. Your children, your grandchildren are going to ask future you about what you did, and you're going to want to say you did the right thing. You're not going to want to have to make a series of excuses about how you would have done the right thing and you kind of did the right thing, but you didn't do entirely the right thing. Like future you is watching, history is watching, and now is the time to take a stand.
Perfectly put. And to that exact point, that is the exact kind of courage, the exact kind of bravery that I think we should be supporting in this moment. So for everybody who's watching right now, one small step we can all take to support the invaluable work that Mark and his team are doing is to sign up for Democracy Docket. It's the news outlet he founded to focus on everything voting in elections. I'll put the link right here on the screen and also in the post description of this video. I'm Brian Tyler Cohen.
I'm Mark Elias.